Hello and welcome to Kilmainham Gaol for another one of our Kilmainham Gaol on lockdown videos. This is the sixth part of our series on the Invincibles, and we're here in the yard that became known as the Invincibles yard because it was here that 5 of that group were hanged and then buried between May and June of 1883. As I mentioned in the last video, a special wooden scaffold was built in this yard for the executions, and the procedure after each hanging was pretty much the same. After the man died, he had to be left hanging for at least an hour before his body could be taken down, and then it would have been placed on a wooden trestle table beside the scaffold so it could be inspected as part of the inquest proceedings. There was a separate inquest with a separate jury for each of the executed men, and the body would have been viewed by officers of the jail, most notably the medical officer, Dr. Cart, who would have done a medical examination of it. He would also have been joined by the coroner, and all the members of the jury had to also view the body. In addition, journalists, a select number, had been allowed access to the building after the hanging, and they were brought down here to view the body and were also allowed to attend the inquest. And when that inspection was finished, they would have headed inside to the jail building for the formal inquest proper. Presumably, at some point during the day, the executed man would have been taken and buried in this yard. We believe that they were buried here and covered in quicklime. So all 5 of the Invincibles are buried somewhere in this yard. We also believe that 6 other men who were executed in Kilmainham Gaol after this date were also buried in this yard. Unfortunately, the exact location of any of these burials is unknown. So we're just going to follow the path of those attending the inquest back in 1883. Some of the journalists mention how strict the jail staff were in terms of who was allowed into the building and how all their credentials were scrutinised in detail. They didn't want anybody to be in the jail who shouldn't have been there. And as we go along here, if you have been to Kilmainham before, you may be familiar with the corridor above us, known as the 1916 corridor, where many of the leaders of the 1916 Rising spent their last night before their execution. Interestingly, Ty Hopkins, who wrote a book about the events that took place in Kilmainham in the 1880s, he published his book in 1896 with photographs of the interior of the jail, and he refers to this corridor as the Informer's Corridor, which might suggest that members of the Invincibles who decided to confess and inform against their former comrades were separated out from the rest of the prison population and kept up there. Where we're heading now, we believe, is where the inquest took place, because a number of the journalists who wrote about it mentioned that the inquest was held in rooms that had recently been used by Charles Stewart Parnell, head of the Irish Parliamentary Party and the Irish Land League. He'd been a prisoner here with many of his colleagues during the Irish Land War between 1881 and 1882, and he was given use of this room, a relatively large and airy room. You can see an image of him here from the London Illustrated News while he was incarcerated. This room had previously been the matron's office. The matron would have looked after the female prisoners in the jail, but the women prisoners were all moved out in 1881, and after that date Kilmainham Gaol became an all-male prison until it closed as a criminal jail in 1910. You didn't get women prisoners here again until after the 1916 Rising, when Kilmainham was used as a military prison. But this is where we believe the inquest was held, and it would have been presided over by the coroner, Dr. Harty. The jury would have been here, journalists and witnesses, and I suppose the chief witness would have been the doctor based in the jail, Dr. Cart, and he would have been asked to give the cause of death for the 5 men. Now, in 4 out of the 5 cases, the cause of death was rupture to the spine in the cervical area, and essentially what he meant by that was that their neck was broken. That would suggest that in 4 cases the hanging went to plan. However, in the case of poor Thomas Caffrey, the cause of death was asphyxiation, which means that the hanging didn't go as it should. His neck wasn't broken, and essentially he would have strangled to death, which was a particularly awful way to die. There is one more grisly anecdote associated with the inquest into the death of Joe Brady, the first of the men to be executed. Apparently, Dr. Cart and a number of other medical men made a special request that they might be given the head of Joe Brady for medical study. This wasn't that unusual at the time. There was a kind of a pseudoscience in the 19th century which suggested that those convicted of crimes, that their heads and their brains might somehow be reflective of their criminality. And obviously Dr. Cart and the other doctors would have seen Joe Brady just, I suppose, as another high-profile criminal. Interestingly, his request was granted, and the head was severed from the body, and it was given then to Inspector Mallon, the police officer who'd essentially cracked the case. He was given the head of Joe Brady and told to bring it to the Royal College of Surgeons. And a journalist who knew Mallon kind of bumped into him outside the jail and couldn't understand why Mallon was quite rude and brusque and wouldn't stop and talk and wouldn't interact with him at all. And it was only years later that Mallon explained to him that the reason he was so flustered and in such a hurry was that he had Joe Brady's head in his bag and that he wanted to get it into the College of Surgeons as soon as he could. So I suppose with those inquests, that was the end of the formal aspect of the executions of each of these 5 men. We have one more video to go where we look at, I suppose, one of the major loose ends, what happened to James Carey, the man who was not only responsible in many ways for setting up the Invincibles here in Dublin, but also the man who was responsible for those 5 men going to their death, because as we mentioned in our previous videos, it was his testimony that really proved crucial in getting convictions and the subsequent executions. But until then, take care, and we'll talk to you soon.